Before dawn on April 9th, 1940, as much of Europe's attention lingered on France, Germany unleashed a northern gamble, deploying over 100,000 troops in a desperate rush to seize the Swedish iron ore lifeline and Norway's icy ports before the Allies could react. Denmark surrendered in hours, and in the fjords, resistance triggered chaos. But why did Berlin risk so much on these frozen outposts? And how did this audacious move reshape the entire war? The answer traces back to a single, chilling question. What happens when a nation's survival depends on a single supply line? German industry ran on steel, and steel depended on Swedish iron ore. Each winter, as the Baltic Sea froze, the Reich's main supply route from the mines in Kiruna to the port of Luleå shut down, cutting off nearly half of Germany's iron imports. That left one vital artery open, the rail line over the mountains to Narvik, and from there, ships carrying ore south along the Norwegian coast. Narvik's harbor stayed ice-free year-round, making it the only reliable outlet during the long winter months. In 1939, nearly 8 million tons of iron ore moved along this route, enough to supply 40% of Germany's total demand. Every shell, tank, and aircraft rolling off German assembly lines owed its existence to these shipments. Without them, Hitler's war machine would grind to a halt. British naval patrols prowled the North Sea, and the Royal Navy eyed the Norwegian corridor as a weak spot in Germany's armor. The Reich's ore carriers hugged the Norwegian coast, sometimes sailing just inside neutral waters to avoid Allied interception. London's planners discussed mining the approaches to Narvik, hoping to choke off the ore flow and starve German industry. The threat of blockade loomed with every ton loaded onto a freighter. The geography of Scandinavia amplified the risk. If the Allies seized Norway's ports or disrupted the Kiruna to Narvik railway, the Reich would lose its winter lifeline. German planners saw the numbers on their ledgers, millions of tons of ore at stake, and with them, the fate of their entire military campaign. The survival of the German economy and the ability to wage war at all now hinged on a single, narrow supply chain winding through the snowbound north. This dependence set the stage for a decision that would defy military convention. The need to secure the flow of iron ore transformed remote, icy outposts into targets of the highest urgency and made the control of Norway and Denmark not just a strategic preference, but a matter of national survival. Admiral Erich Raeder paced the halls of the Reich Chancellery, his mind racing with reports from the North Sea. The Kriegsmarine's chief had warned Hitler for months. If the Allies moved first, Germany's lifeline to Swedish iron ore would be severed. In October 1939, Raeder sent a memorandum to Hitler, laying out the threat in stark terms. British warships could choke the Norwegian corridor at any moment. The loss of Narvik and the fjord ports would not only cripple the Navy, it would bring the entire war effort to its knees. By early April 1940, British intentions were no longer a matter of speculation. Intelligence reached Berlin that the Royal Navy planned to mine Norwegian waters, a move that would force German ore carriers into open sea and straight into the jaws of Allied patrols. The British operation had a name, Wilfred. Its orders were set for April 8th. For Raeder and the OKW High Command, the clock had started ticking. The German staff dusted off their contingency plan, Studi Nord. The time for caution had passed. On April 5th, Hitler gathered his generals and naval commanders. Raeder pressed his case. Delay meant disaster. If Britain and France seized Norway's Atlantic ports, the Reich would lose not just ore, but the chance to project naval and air power into the North Atlantic. Submarine bases on the Norwegian coast could extend the U-boat reach by 1,000 kilometers, threatening Allied convoys and reshaping the naval war. The decision came swiftly. Orders for Operation Weserübung were confirmed. Troop transports, destroyers, and paratroopers would launch simultaneous assaults on Denmark and Norway. The invasion would begin before dawn. The pace of planning turned frantic, with staff officers working through the night. Every hour counted. As British mines dropped into the icy waters off Narvik on April 8th, German ships were already steaming north, loaded with men and materiel. The gamble was set. The outcome would decide not just the fate of Scandinavia, but the survival of Germany's war machine. The first German units crossed the Danish border before dawn, engines rumbling through the mist, as columns of troops rolled into Jutland. In Copenhagen, the city woke to the sound of aircraft overhead and the sudden presence of foreign soldiers at the docks. The invasion was not just a military maneuver, it was a shock delivered with surgical precision. By 5:25 a.m., German planes strafed the airfield at Verluse, destroying nearly half of Denmark's air force before a single Danish fighter could take off. Paratroopers seized Aalborg Airport, the link to Norway. Within the hour, German diplomats arrived at Amalienborg Palace, presenting an ultimatum to King Christian X and his ministers to surrender or face the bombing of Copenhagen. Inside the cabinet room, Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning listened to urgent reports from the front. The Royal Guard had exchanged fire with German troops near the palace gates, but resistance was scattered and brief. 16 Danish soldiers lay dead. The country's military, just 14,500 men with outdated weapons, stood no chance against the force now occupying its capital and airfields. Stauning weighed the choices with Foreign Minister Peter Munch and the king. The generals argued for a stand, but the reality was clear. Every minute of defiance risked the lives of thousands of civilians in the capital. The Luftwaffe circled above, ready to strike. Copenhagen's flat, open streets offered no shelter. The debate lasted barely an hour. Stauning, a social democrat who had led Denmark through the turbulence of the 1930s, faced a grim calculus. To resist was to invite destruction. To surrender was to lose sovereignty in a single morning. At 8:43 a.m., the government ordered a halt to all fighting. The radio carried the announcement across the country. Denmark would cooperate to spare its people. The decision came not from cowardice, but from a resolve to avoid what had happened to Warsaw just months before. Cities reduced to rubble, and civilians buried beneath collapsed homes. For many Danes, the morning unfolded in a blur. One Copenhagen resident later recalled that the Germans marched in silence and that they froze in shock. The occupation arrived not with fire and blood, but with the cold certainty of overwhelming power. By midday, German troops stood guard outside Parliament and the royal palace. The Danish flag still flew, but the country's fate had been sealed in hours. Only a handful of casualties marked the invasion: 16 soldiers and a few civilians. The coup de resistance had been calculated and, for Denmark, deemed too high to pay. Stauning's voice, steady but heavy, addressed the nation that evening. He spoke of protest, of forced decisions, but above all of the need to preserve life. The government would remain, at least in name, to spare the country worse suffering. In that hour, Denmark's leaders chose survival over sacrifice, setting their story apart from what would soon unfold to the north. In the darkness before dawn, German warships slipped up the Oslo fjord, their hulls slicing through icy water toward the Norwegian capital. They expected a silent passage. Instead, at Oscarsborg Fortress, Colonel Birger Eriksen watched the enemy approach, the fate of his country in his hands. The fortress's main guns, relics from another era, stood ready but untested. Eriksen gave the order, "Fire." The ancient 28-centimeter guns thundered, sending 2 shells crashing into the heavy cruiser. Blücher, flames erupted along her decks. As the Germans scrambled to return fire, smaller batteries joined in, raking the superstructure, igniting fuel and ammunition. Minutes later, from a hidden torpedo battery, Commander Anderson launched 2 torpedoes at point-blank range. The first struck forward, the second, amidships, tearing open the hull. Blücher, flagship of the invasion fleet, staggered past the fortress, burning and listing, then exploded as her magazines detonated. By 6:22 in the morning, she rolled in a sang beneath the surface, taking hundreds of soldiers, sailors, and Gestapo officers with her. Survivors struggled in freezing water, oil burning around them. The Germans had lost their command ship and 1,000 men in less than an hour. The battle bought precious time. In Oslo, sirens wailed as government officials rushed to pack documents, gold reserves, and whatever they could carry. King Haakon VII, refusing to submit, boarded a convoy of cars and trains bound for the interior. The escape was narrow. German paratroopers landed at Fornebu airfield only minutes after the royal party slipped away. In these hours, the constitutional government survived. Its leaders determined to resist occupation rather than surrender. But as the royal convoy sped north, a different drama unfolded in Oslo. Vidkun Quisling, leader of the small fascist National Samling Party, marched into the NRK radio studios with German backing. At 7:30 that evening, his voice crackled across the airwaves. He declared himself prime minister, dissolved the lawful government, and called on Norwegians to accept German authority. The coup, broadcast to a stunned nation, was a world first, an attempted seizure of power by radio. Yet outside the studio, resistance only hardened. Crowds jeered in the streets. The army and police ignored his orders. Even Berlin doubted his usefulness. The day's chaos left Norway's fate hanging by a thread. Eriksen's defiance at Oscarsborg had shattered the German timetable, denying them an easy victory. Haakon's flight turned the monarchy into a symbol of national resistance. Quisling's broadcast, intended to smooth the German path, instead fueled outrage and confusion. In those tense hours, the choices of a few shaped the destiny of a nation and set the emotional stakes for the fierce battles soon to erupt in the mountains and fjords. 10 German destroyers nosed into the fjords near Narvik before dawn. Their decks were packed with Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops, and supplies. The plan called for speed and surprise, to land 2,000 men at the port, seize the railhead, and cut off any chance of Allied intervention. The destroyers were designed for quick strikes, not for comfort or Arctic weather. Soldiers disembarked onto icy docks, boots crunching on frozen planks, breath clouding in the sub-zero air. Narvik, ringed by steep mountains and blanketed in late winter snow, offered no easy welcome. The town itself was small, but the terrain beyond was a maze of ridges, deep valleys, and wind-scoured passes. Every step away from the harbor meant climbing into a world where roads vanished, and the cold seeped through every layer of clothing. The Gebirgsjäger led the way. Many were young, some barely out of school, trained to move fast with little more than what they could carry. One private later wrote that they landed before sunrise. Snow everywhere, the wind stinging faces like needles. They carried packs and rifles up the slopes, slipping on ice, hearts pounding. The Norwegians were somewhere in the hills, and they did not know what was waiting for them. The enemy was invisible at first. No hwattes were fired, only the echo of boots and the distant rumble of engines. The climb into the mountains quickly became a battle against the land itself. Fjords cut deep into the coastline, forcing every movement to follow narrow tracks along cliffs or through forests still heavy with snow. The cold numbed fingers and slowed every task, from digging in to loading a rifle. Frostbite became as real a threat as bullets. Supplies landed by destroyer had to be hauled up steep slopes with sleds or by hand. Even the most basic orders took hours to carry out. Communications broke down in the white silence, and units lost track of each other in the maze of ravines and snowfields. The Germans knew the Allies would try to strike back. Every ridge taken had to be held against counterattacks from British, French, or Norwegian forces, who knew the land better and moved quickly through the forests. For the men who landed that morning, the campaign was not just a fight for control of a port, but a struggle to survive in some of the harshest conditions in Europe. The frozen mountains became both shield and snare, shaping every decision and demanding everything from those who fought there. The mountains around Narvik swallowed entire battalions in snow and silence. But the real cost of the campaign was measured at sea. The fjords became graveyards for destroyers, steel hulls torn open by torpedoes, decks shattered by shellfire. Between April and early June, 24 destroyers were lost in the battles off Narvik, most of them German. The Kriegsmarine, already stretched thin, would never recover from the loss. British destroyers too limped away, battered or did not return at all. The wrecks still litter the fjord, silent reminders of a campaign that drained both sides. On land, the Allies clawed their way back into Narvik. French and Polish troops, fighting alongside Norwegians, under General Carl Gustav Fleischer, managed to retake the town on May 28th. For a moment, it looked like the tide had turned. It was the first time the Wehrmacht had been pushed out of a captured city. The victory, though, was hollow. News from the south changed everything. In France, German tanks had broken through at Sedan, and Paris was under threat. The British and French High Command faced a grim choice: hold Narvik and risk total disaster on the Western Front, or cut their losses in Norway to save what they could in France. The order came quickly. Operation Alphabet, the code name for evacuation, began on June 4th. Over 4 nights, Allied troops slipped away from Narvik's battered docks, boarding ships bound for Britain. Norwegian soldiers left behind watched the last vessels disappear into the gray Arctic dawn. By June 8th, the last Allied units had withdrawn. The campaign that had begun as a desperate gamble for iron ore and naval bases ended with a quiet retreat. The cost was staggering. Thousands were dead or missing. The Royal Navy had lost precious destroyers it could ill afford to replace. For the Norwegians, the sense of abandonment cut deep. Diaries from the front lines speak of anger and confusion, victory snatched away, promises broken. The Allies' withdrawal left Norway fully exposed to occupation. For Germany, the losses at sea were severe, but the prize was won. The iron ore would flow, and the naval bases along Norway's coast would help shape the next years of the war. The campaign's outcome was not a triumph of arms, but a lesson in the limits of intervention and the unforgiving arithmetic of war. Europe's northern front changed overnight, not by size, but by speed and surprise. Control of resources and routes still drives strategy today, as nations race for Arctic influence and mineral wealth. The lessons of 1940 echo in every scramble for critical supply lines. History's gambles aren't relics, they're blueprints. Drop your thoughts below. How do you see these echoes shaping our world now?